The gavel struck wood with the finality of a coffin nail. 3 times, sharp echoing cracks that seemed to split the humid Georgia air in half. Samuel Hartwell stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered hands gripping a piece of paper so tightly that his knuckles had gone white as bone. The ink was still wet from his signature, still smudged where his palm had pressed against it in desperation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lot 17, the auctioneer's voice boomed across the packed courthouse square. One healthy girl, age 16, skilled in domestic duties, reading and arithmetic. Opening bid set at $200. The words hit Samuel like physical blows. Each syllable was a betrayal of everything he'd promised his dying wife, everything he'd sworn to protect. But the bank notice in his other pocket burned hotter than shame, and the empty grain silo back at the farm spoke louder than his conscience. 3 failed harvests, a mortgage he couldn't pay, and creditors circling like vultures had brought him to this moment, this unthinkable, necessary moment. Beneath the massive oak tree that had witnessed 100 such auctions, his daughter Emma stood with her head held high, 16 years old, with her mother's auburn hair braided down her back and eyes the color of deep forest shade. She wore the blue dress her mother had sewn for her last birthday, the one with tiny pearl buttons that caught the afternoon sunlight. Her hands were folded in front of her, steady as stone, but Samuel could see the slight tremor in her chin that she was fighting to control. She hadn't spoken to him since yesterday morning when he'd told her what had to be done. Hadn't looked at him either, except for one moment when their eyes met across the breakfast table, and he saw something die behind her gaze. Not anger, not fear, but something worse. Understanding, the terrible adult understanding that sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who hurt you deepest. The crowd pressed closer, a sea of faces both familiar and strange. Plantation owners from 3 counties over, their wives fanning themselves with elaborate peacock feathers, merchants from Savannah looking for household help, men in work clothes who'd scraped together every penny they had, hoping to buy what they couldn't afford to marry. Samuel recognized half of them, had shared drinks with some, traded cattle with others. Now they stared at his daughter like she was livestock, calculating her worth in dollars and labor. 200, do I hear 200? The auctioneer, a thin man named Caldwell with a voice trained to carry across cotton fields, scanned the crowd with practiced eyes. Fine young lady here, gentlemen. Look at those hands. Not a callus on them, but strong enough for any work you need done. Samuel's stomach turned. He'd known Caldwell for 15 years, had sold him a milk cow just last spring. Now the man spoke, about Emma like she was merchandise, pointing out her qualities with the same detached professionalism he'd use to describe a horse or a plot of land. A hand shot up near the back. 200. Samuel turned to see who had spoken first. It was Marcus Webb, a tobacco farmer from the next county over, a widower with 3 young children and a reputation for working his help harder than most. Samuel's throat tightened. He'd hoped, foolishly perhaps, that someone kind might bid, someone who would treat Emma well, maybe even let her keep some small piece of herself. Another voice called out, 225. Then another, 250. The bidding began to pick up momentum, voices cutting through the thick air like competing church bells. Samuel watched the numbers climb, each increase representing another nail in the coffin of his daughter's freedom. 275, 300, 325. Men he'd shared Sunday dinners with were now haggling over his child's future. Like traders in a livestock market, Emma stood perfectly still through it all, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the crowd, beyond the square, perhaps beyond Georgia itself. She'd always been stronger than she looked, his Emma. Even as a small child, she'd possessed a quiet dignity that reminded him painfully of her mother. Catherine had stood the same way on their wedding day, composed and graceful, even when the whole world was watching. Catherine, God, what would she think if she could see this? She died 3 years ago from the fever, and with her final breath, she'd made Samuel promise to take care of their daughter, to keep her safe, to see her educated, to help her become the woman she was meant to be. Instead, he was selling her to the highest bidder, like a piece of property. The bidding reached $400, then $450. Samuel's heart pounded with each increase. Part of him was sickened by how much they were willing to pay for his daughter. Another part, the practical farmer's part that had kept them alive this long, was relieved that at least the price was climbing high enough to satisfy his debts. $475. Do I hear 500? Caldwell's voice rang out over the murmuring crowd. That's when Samuel first noticed him. The stranger stood apart from the others, leaning against a black carriage parked at the edge of the square. He was tall, perhaps 40 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair and a face that spoke of money and education. His clothes were expensive but not flashy, a dark wool suit that probably cost more than Samuel made in a good year. Everything about him was precise, controlled, from his polished shoes to the gold pocket watch chain glinting at his vest. But it wasn't his wealth that caught Samuel's attention. It was the way he was looking at Emma. Most of the bidders studied her with calculating eyes, measuring her potential value as a worker or worse. This man stared at her with something that looked almost like recognition. His dark eyes intense and unblinking. His hands, Samuel noticed, were gripped tightly behind his back, and there was a tension in his shoulders that suggested he was fighting some internal battle. 500, came a voice from the middle of the crowd. A cotton merchant Samuel didn't recognize, fat and sweating in the afternoon heat. 525, countered another bidder. The stranger pushed away from his carriage and began moving through the crowd, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. People stepped aside for him instinctively, recognizing money and power even when they couldn't place their source. He moved with purpose, like a man who'd made a decision and was prepared to see it through regardless of the cost. 550, called out Marcus Webb, sweat beading on his forehead. 600. The stranger's voice cut through the afternoon heat like a blade through silk. Clear, cultured, with an accent that suggested education far beyond the borders of rural Georgia. Every head in the crowd turned toward him, and Samuel felt a chill run down his spine, despite the oppressive heat. The stranger had positioned himself near the front now, close enough that Samuel could see his face clearly. There was something familiar about him, though Samuel couldn't place what. Something in the set of his jaw, the shape of his eyes, that nagged at the edges of memory like a half-remembered dream. 600? Do I hear 625? Caldwell's voice had taken on a new enthusiasm. This was shaping up to be one of the highest-priced auctions he'd conducted all year. 625, Webb called out, but his voice lacked conviction. Now, 600 was already more than most men in the county made in 2 years. 700. The stranger's response was immediate, his tone suggesting that money was no object. Around him, other bidders began to step back, recognizing when they were outclassed. For the first time since stepping onto the auction block, Emma turned her head. She looked directly at the stranger, and Samuel saw something flicker across her face. Confusion, perhaps, or a kind of startled recognition that mirrored what he'd felt moments before. The stranger met her gaze steadily, and for a long moment, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. $700, Caldwell announced, his voice ringing with satisfaction. Do I hear 725? Silence fell over the crowd like a blanket. $700 was more money than most of these men had ever seen in one place, the kind of sum that could buy a small farm or feed a family for years. The other bidders looked at each other with mixtures of respect and resentment, knowing they'd been beaten by someone playing a different game entirely, 700 going once, Caldwell called out, his gavel raised. Samuel felt time slow down around him. In a few seconds, his daughter would belong to this stranger, this wealthy man whose intentions he couldn't read. Emma would be led away to a life he knew nothing about, to serve a master whose kindness or cruelty remained a mystery. He'd solved his immediate problems, saved the farm, paid off the creditors, but at a cost that would haunt him for the rest of his days, going twice. The stranger stepped closer to the auction block, his eyes still locked on Emma's face. There was something desperate in his expression now, something that went beyond simple desire to win a bidding war. He looked like a man staring at a ghost, or perhaps at a miracle he'd never expected to witness. Emma continued to stare back at him, her composure finally beginning to crack. Her hands, which had remained steady throughout the entire ordeal, were now trembling slightly. A single tear tracked down her cheek, catching the sunlight before disappearing into the collar of her blue dress. "Sold!" The gavel fell with finality, and Samuel's knees nearly buckled. It was done. His daughter now belonged to a stranger, but instead of stepping forward to claim his purchase, the stranger did something unexpected. He walked directly to Emma, stopping just close enough to speak without the crowd overhearing. Samuel watched his lips move, saw Emma's eyes widen in shock, and then something extraordinary happened. She began to cry. Not the quiet, dignified tears she'd been fighting all afternoon, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond grief. And through her tears, she whispered something back to the stranger that made him stagger as if he'd been struck. The crowd began to murmur, sensing that something unusual was unfolding, but unable to hear the words being exchanged. Samuel pushed forward, desperate to understand what was happening to his daughter, what this stranger had said to provoke such a reaction. As he got closer, he caught fragments of their conversation. "Thought you were dead," Emma was saying, her voice thick with tears. "I thought I'd never find you," the stranger replied, and now Samuel could see that his eyes were wet too. "When I heard about the auction, when I saw the description, I had to come. I had to see if it was really—" 17 years, Emma whispered. 17 years I've wondered. The stranger nodded, his composure finally cracking completely. "I looked everywhere, every town, every county. Your mother, she moved so many times, changed your name so often. I hired investigators, placed advertisements in newspapers, but she was always one step ahead." Samuel felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The stranger was talking about Catherine, his wife, Emma's mother, but that was impossible. Catherine had been a widow when he met her, had told him Emma's father died in a mill accident before she was born. She'd never mentioned anyone looking for them, never suggested that Emma's father might still be alive. "She told me you were dead," Emma said, echoing Samuel's thoughts. "She said you died before I was born, that you never even knew I existed." The stranger shook his head slowly. I knew. I knew the moment she told me she was carrying my child. I wanted to marry her, Emma. I begged her to let me take care of both of you. But she said I was too young, that my family would never accept her, that it was better if I just disappeared." Around them, the crowd was growing restless, unable to understand why the highest bidder wasn't completing his transaction. Caldwell stepped down from his platform, his expression confused and slightly irritated. "Excuse me, sir," he said to the stranger. "If you're having second thoughts about your purchase, there are other interested parties who—" "I'm not having second thoughts," the stranger said firmly, not taking his eyes off Emma. "But I'm not here to buy a servant. I'm here to reclaim my daughter." The words hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and every person in the square turned to stare at the scene unfolding near the auction block. Samuel felt his legs give way entirely, and he sank onto a nearby bench, his mind reeling. Emma's father. This stranger, this wealthy man who'd just paid $700 for her, was claiming to be her biological father. The father Catherine had told them both was dead. The father Emma had mourned without ever knowing. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "That's impossible," Samuel managed to say, his voice hoarse with shock. "Catherine told me," she said. The stranger finally turned to look at him, and Samuel saw a mixture of pity and understanding in his eyes. "Catherine told you many things. That weren't true, Mr. Hartwell. She was protecting Emma in her way, but she was also protecting herself. And me, I suppose." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather portfolio, worn smooth from years of handling. From it he extracted a small daguerreotype, the edges yellowed with age. He handed it to Emma, who took it with trembling fingers. Samuel couldn't see the image from where he sat, but he watched Emma's face as she studied it. Her breath caught, and she pressed the photograph to her chest as if it was something precious. "Beyond measure, that's your mother," the stranger said quietly. "Catherine Sullivan before she became Catherine Hartwell. She was 19 when that was taken, about 6 months before you were born. I've carried it with me every day for 17 years, hoping that someday I'd be able to show it to you." Emma looked up at him through her tears. "What's your name?" she whispered. "William," he said. "William Montgomery. And you're Emma Catherine Montgomery, not Emma Hartwell. You're my daughter, and I've been searching for you since the day you were born." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. William Montgomery. Even Samuel, isolated as he was on his small farm, had heard that name. Montgomery was one of the wealthiest men in Georgia, owner of textile mills throughout the state, rumored to be worth more than some small towns. His factories employed thousands. His influence reached into the state capital, and his name appeared regularly in the Savannah newspapers. And according to him, Emma was his daughter, his heir. Samuel's mind raced backward through the years, searching for clues he might have missed. Catherine's reluctance to talk about her past, the way she sometimes seemed nervous when strangers came to the farm, her insistence that they never travel too far from home. He'd attributed it to natural shyness, to grief over her first husband's death. Now he wondered if it had been fear instead, fear that someone would find them. "She made me promise," William continued, speaking to Emma, but loud enough for Samuel to hear. "Your mother made me promise to leave you both alone, to let you live your lives without interference from me or my family. She said it was better that way, safer, but I never stopped looking. I never stopped hoping that someday—" He gestured helplessly at the auction block, at the crowd, at the entire surreal situation they found themselves in. "When I heard about the auction, when I saw the description and the name, I knew it had to be you. Catherine always said you had her hair and my eyes. And you do, Emma. You have my eyes exactly." Emma stared at him intently, as if trying to memorize every detail of his face. "Why didn't she tell me? Why did she let me think you were dead?" William's expression grew pained. "Because she was probably right to do so. My family, they wouldn't have welcomed you or your mother. Not then. A mill owner's son getting involved with a seamstress's daughter, having a child out of wedlock, it would have been a scandal they couldn't tolerate. They would have made life very difficult for all of us." "But you would have tried," Emma said. "It wasn't a question. I would have tried," he confirmed. "I was young and foolish and convinced I could overcome any obstacle for love." Catherine was wiser. She knew the world better than I did, understood the costs in ways I couldn't, so she disappeared one night, left town without telling anyone where she was going. It took me 3 months just to discover she'd gone south, instead of north. Samuel finally found his voice. "She married me 2 years later," he said, the words feeling strange in his throat. "Said she was a widow, that Emma's father had died in a mill accident. I never questioned it. She seemed so sad when she talked about it that I stopped asking." William nodded slowly. "She wasn't lying about the sadness. Leaving me nearly killed her, according to her sister. But she thought it was the right thing. To do the only way to protect Emma from a world that would never fully accept her. And now, Emma asked, "What's different now?" William smiled for the first time since the auction began, and Samuel was struck by how much the expression transformed. His face, the stern, calculating businessman, disappeared, replaced by someone younger and infinitely more hopeful. "Now I'm not a boy anymore," he said. "I'm a man with his own fortune and his own power. I don't need my family's approval or anyone else's. And more importantly, now I know where you are." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Emma, I paid $700 for you today, but not to own you. I paid it to free you. You're my daughter, and I want to give you everything I should have given you from the beginning: a name, an education, a place in the world where you belong." The crowd had grown absolutely silent, hanging on every word of this impossible reunion. Even Caldwell seemed to have forgotten about completing the transaction, his gavel hanging forgotten in his hand. But what about him? Emma gestured towards Samuel, and for the first time since the stranger's revelation, she looked at the man who'd raised her. "He's been my father for 14 years. He's the one who taught me to read, who stayed up with me when I was sick, who walked me to school every day until I was old enough to go alone." Samuel felt tears threatening for the first time all day. Despite everything, despite the auction and the betrayal and the desperate circumstances that had brought them here, Emma was still thinking of him, still considering his feelings in the midst of her own earth-shaking moment. William followed her gaze and studied Samuel with new interest. "Mr. Hartwell," he said formally, "I owe you a debt I can never repay. You loved my daughter when I couldn't, raised her when I was absent, protected her when I didn't even know she needed protection. Whatever mistakes led to today's circumstances, that doesn't diminish what you've done for her." Samuel met his eyes, seeing sincerity there that surprised him. "I love her like she was my own blood," he said simply. "That's not going to change, no matter what happens next." "I'm glad to hear that," William replied, "because I'm hoping it won't have to." He turned back to Emma, his expression serious. "I want you to come with me, Emma. I want to give you the life you should have had from the beginning, but I don't want to tear you away from the only family you've known. Mr. Hartwell will always be welcome in our home, and if you choose to visit here to maintain the relationships you've built, I'll support that completely." Emma looked between the two men, her young face showing wisdom far beyond her 16 years. The choice she faced was impossible in its complexity. Stay with the man who'd raised her but had just sold her to pay his debts, or go with her biological father, a stranger who promised wealth and position but remained largely unknown. "I need time," she said finally. It's too much to decide right now." William nodded immediately. "Of course, you can have all the time you need." He turned to Caldwell, who was still standing nearby with his mouth slightly open, trying to process everything he'd witnessed. "The auction is concluded," William said firmly. "I've paid the agreed price, and I'm claiming what I purchased. But rather than taking possession immediately, I'm granting Miss Montgomery time to consider her options." "Miss Montgomery," Caldwell repeated weakly. "Miss Emma Catherine Montgomery," William confirmed. "My daughter, and as such, is no longer subject to being sold by anyone." The legal implications of his words rippled through the crowd like stones thrown in still water. If Emma was truly William Montgomery's legitimate daughter, if he acknowledged her publicly as such, then Samuel's right to sell her became questionable at best. A father's authority superseded a stepfather's, especially when the biological father had the wealth and influence to make his claims stick in court. Samuel felt a mixture of relief and terror wash over him. Relief that Emma might escape the fate he'd condemned her to, terror that he might lose her forever in the bargain. "Mr. Hartwell," William said, approaching him directly, "I'd like to speak with you privately if you're willing. There are things we need to discuss, arrangements to be made. Samuel nodded mutely, not trusting his voice. The afternoon that had started with such desperate certainty had transformed into something beyond his wildest imagination. His stepdaughter was apparently the child of one of Georgia's wealthiest men. The auction he'd dreaded was turning into a reunion he'd never expected, and his own future had become uncertain in ways he couldn't begin to calculate. As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement over the drama they'd witnessed, Emma remained standing near the auction block. She looked small and overwhelmed, caught between two worlds and two versions of herself. The Emma Hartwell who'd grown up on a struggling farm, and the Emma Montgomery who might inherit textile mills and social prominence. William approached her once more, moving slowly as if afraid she might bolt. "Emma," he said softly, "I know. This is overwhelming. I know you need time to think, to decide what you want, but I want you to know one thing above all else." She looked up at him expectantly. "I never stopped loving you," he said, his voice thick with 17 years of suppressed emotion. "Not for a single day. Every choice I've made, every dollar I've earned, every moment of success or failure, it's all been with the hope that someday I'd find you and be able to give you the world." Emma's composure finally cracked completely. She stepped forward and, for the first time, embraced the father she'd never known she had. William's arms came around her immediately, holding her as if he'd never let her go again. Over her shoulder, his eyes met Samuel's, and in that gaze, Samuel saw gratitude, determination, and a promise that Emma's future would be everything her past had not been able to provide. The Montgomery carriage rolled through the gates of Willowbrook Estate as the sun dipped below the Georgia pines, casting long shadows across manicured lawns that stretched farther than Emma had ever imagined possible. She pressed her face to the window, watching servants in crisp uniforms tend to flower beds that bloomed in perfect geometric patterns. Everything here spoke of wealth, so profound it seemed almost fictional. 3 days had passed since the auction. 3 days of William Montgomery, patiently waiting, while Emma wrestled with a decision that would reshape her entire existence. He'd taken rooms at the finest hotel in town, spent his mornings walking the courthouse square where they'd first truly met, and his afternoons sitting on Samuel's front porch, sharing stories of Catherine that Emma had never heard. Now, finally, she'd agreed to see his world, not to commit to it, but to understand what accepting his offer would mean. Samuel sat beside her in the carriage, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. William had insisted he come along, saying that any conversation about Emma's future needed to include the man who'd shaped her past. But Samuel looked deeply uncomfortable, surrounded by such luxury, his work clothes seeming shabby against the carriage's velvet upholstery. "The house was built by my grandfather in 1823, William said, his voice carrying a mix of pride and something else Emma couldn't quite identify. 47 rooms, including a library with over 3,000 books and a music room where my mother used to play piano before." He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. Emma caught the hesitation. "Before what?" William glanced out the window at the approaching mansion, its white columns gleaming in the fading light. "Before I disappointed her with my choices. Before I fell in love with a woman she deemed unsuitable for our family name." The carriage came to a stop before the most magnificent house Emma had ever seen. It rose 3 stories high, with wraparound porches and tall windows that glowed warmly from within. Servants appeared immediately to help them down, their movements practiced and efficient. Mr. William, an elderly black man in an impeccable suit, greeted them. "Welcome home, sir." "Thank you, Marcus," William replied warmly. "This is my daughter Emma and Mr. Hartwell, who raised her. Please see that they're made comfortable in the blue guest suite and the adjoining room." Marcus's eyes widened slightly at the word daughter, but his professionalism never wavered. "Of course, sir. Dinner will be served at 8, if that's acceptable." As they climbed the front steps, Emma noticed William's posture change subtly. The easy confidence he'd displayed over the past few days was replaced by something more guarded, more careful. She realized this homecoming wasn't entirely comfortable for him either. The interior of the house took Emma's breath away. Crystal. Chandeliers cast rainbow patterns on polished marble floors, and paintings in golden frames lined walls that stretched up to impossibly high ceilings. A grand staircase curved upward like something from a fairy tale, its banister carved from what looked like a single piece of mahogany. But what struck Emma most was the silence. Despite its grandeur, the house felt empty, almost hollow. Their footsteps echoed in ways that suggested these magnificent rooms were rarely filled with laughter or conversation. "It's quite different from what you're used to," William said, watching. Her reaction carefully, Emma nodded, still taking it all in. "It's beautiful, but it doesn't feel like a home. It feels like a museum." William's expression grew thoughtful. "That's exactly what my mother always said. She claimed I was too much like my grandfather, too focused on business to properly appreciate the finer things." He paused at the bottom of the staircase. "She died 2 years ago, and since then I've barely used half of these rooms." They were interrupted by the appearance of a woman in her 50s, dressed in black silk with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. She moved with the fluid grace of someone born to wealth, but her eyes held a coldness that made Emma instinctively step closer to Samuel. "William," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of Charleston society, "I heard you'd returned with guests." "Aunt Margaret," William replied, his tone carefully neutral. "I'd like you to meet Emma Montgomery, my daughter, and Samuel Hartwell, who's been caring for her." The woman's face went through a series of subtle changes, shock giving way to calculation, and then settling into something that looked like barely controlled fury. "Your daughter?" She repeated each word precisely enunciated. "Yes, Emma Catherine Montgomery, my daughter with Catherine Sullivan." Margaret's lips tightened into a thin line. "The seamstress," she said, making the profession sound like a disease. "I thought we'd agreed that the unfortunate chapter was closed, William." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, William stepped forward, his voice carrying a warning edge. "That unfortunate chapter resulted in the most important person in my life, Aunt Margaret. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly." The tension in the grand foyer was thick enough to cut with a knife. Emma looked between the two adults, beginning to understand that her arrival here represented more than just a family reunion. She was walking into the middle of a conflict that had been brewing for 17 years. Margaret's gaze shifted to Emma, studying her with the calculating look of someone appraising livestock. "She has the Sullivan look about her," she said finally. "The red hair, the stubborn set to her jaw. I suppose there's no denying the resemblance." "There was never any question about paternity," William said firmly. "I've known Emma was my daughter since before she was born." "Known, perhaps, but acknowledging her publicly is another matter entirely." Margaret's voice carried 17 years of accumulated frustration. "Do you have any idea what this will do to our standing in society? What will people say when they learn you've suddenly produced an illegitimate daughter?" Emma flinched at the word illegitimate, but Samuel's hand came to rest gently on her shoulder, steadying her. "I don't particularly care what people say," William replied, "and Emma is not illegitimate. She's my daughter, and I'm claiming her as such." Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You can't simply declare a bastard child legitimate. William, the law doesn't work that way, and neither does society." This time Emma did step forward, her green eyes flashing with inherited fire. "I may be many things, Ma'am, but I'm not a bastard. My parents loved each other even if they weren't married. That's more than can be said for a lot of marriages I've seen." Margaret's eyebrows rose at Emma's boldness, but before she could respond, a new voice joined the conversation. "Well, well, what have we here?" A young man descended the staircase, perhaps 25 years old, with the same dark hair as William, but softer features and clothing that suggested he'd never done a day's physical labor in his life. His smile was charming, but somehow didn't reach his eyes. "Charles," William said with obvious reluctance, "I didn't know you were staying here." "Mother invited me for the week," Charles replied, his gaze fixed on Emma with interest that made her uncomfortable. "She said you'd had some sort of business emergency that required immediate attention. She didn't mention it involved such a lovely young lady." William's jaw tightened. "Emma, Samuel, I'd like you to meet my cousin Charles Montgomery." "Charles, this is my daughter Emma and her guardian Samuel Hartwell." Charles's charming smile faltered slightly. "Your daughter? I wasn't aware you had any children, cousin." "It's a recent development," Margaret interjected smoothly. "William has decided to acknowledge the child he fathered with a servant girl 17 years ago." The way she said it made Emma's skin crawl, as if her very existence was something shameful that had to be explained and excused. "How progressive of you, William," Charles said, his tone suggesting he found the situation more amusing than shocking. "And you've brought her here to live?" "I've brought her here so she can understand her options," William corrected. "The choice of where and how she lives is entirely hers to make." Emma looked around at the magnificent house, at the family members who clearly saw her as an unwelcome complication, at Samuel standing quietly beside her with his worn clothes and work-hardened hands, so obviously out of place among all this finery. "Perhaps we could discuss this over dinner," William suggested, but his voice carried strain. "Emma and Mr. Hartwell have had a long journey, and I'm sure they'd appreciate the chance to freshen up." "Of course," Margaret said, her social training taking over despite her obvious displeasure. "Dinner at 8 as usual. I'll have cook prepare something suitable." As they were shown to their rooms, Emma caught fragments of heated conversation from the foyer below. Margaret's voice, sharp with indignation. 17 years of careful reputation building. Charles's smoother tones. Could be managed with the right approach. And through it all, William's deeper voice, firm but weary. "My decision to make." The blue guest suite was larger than the entire main floor of Samuel's farmhouse. Emma stood in the center of the room, turning slowly to take in the silk wallpaper, the four-poster bed with its elaborate canopy, the sitting area arranged around a marble fireplace. It was beautiful beyond anything she'd ever imagined, but it felt as foreign as if she'd stepped onto another planet. Samuel appeared in the connecting doorway, looking as overwhelmed as she felt. "Emma," he said quietly, "are you sure about this?" She sank into one of the upholstered chairs, suddenly exhausted. "I'm not sure about anything, Samuel. 3 days ago, I thought I was going to be sold to a tobacco farmer. Now I'm supposedly the daughter of one of the richest men in Georgia, sitting in a room that probably costs more than most people make in a lifetime. That woman downstairs, his aunt," Samuel said carefully, "she doesn't want you here." Emma nodded. "Neither does his cousin. I can see it in their eyes. They think I'm going to embarrass them, or take something that belongs to them." "Maybe they're right to be worried," Samuel said, surprising her. "You are going to take something from them. You're going to take William's attention, his affection, probably a share of his inheritance. That threatens everything they've built. Their lives around." A soft knock interrupted their conversation. "Come in," Emma called, and a young woman about her own age entered, carrying a tray of tea and small cakes. "Mr. William thought you might be hungry," the girl said shyly. She was clearly a servant, but her dress was clean and well made, and she moved with quiet confidence. "I'm Lucy," One of the housemaids. If you need anything, just ring the bell by your bed." "Thank you, Lucy," Emma said warmly. "This is very kind." Lucy smiled, seeming surprised by Emma's friendly tone. "Are you really Mr. William's daughter?" she asked, then blushed. "I'm sorry, it's not my place to ask, but the whole house is talking about it." "It's all right," Emma assured her. "Yes, apparently I am, though I only found out 3 days ago myself." "He talks about you sometimes," Lucy said quietly, glancing toward the door to make sure they wouldn't be overheard. "When he's been drinking his evening brandy, he gets this look in his eyes, sad-like. He'll mention a little girl with red hair that he lost and how he wonders what became of her." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. "He talked about me?" Lucy nodded earnestly. "Every year, on your birthday, he gets quiet and distant. The staff all knows not to bother him much on April 15th. Now we know why." After Lucy left, Emma sat staring into the fire that had been lit against the evening chill. Her birthday. William had remembered her birthday every year, had carried the sadness of her absence through 17 Aprils. The thought filled her with a mixture of warmth and heartbreak. "He's been grieving for you," Samuel said softly. "All these years, he's been grieving for a daughter he'd never really known." Emma turned to look at him, this man who'd raised her with patience and love, despite having no obligation to do so. "What about you, Samuel? If I stay here, what happens to you?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I go back to the farm, I suppose. Try to make the best of what's left. The auction money will keep the creditors away for a while, yes, but it won't change the fact that I'm getting older, that the land's not producing like it used to. Without you there to help with the cooking and the household management," he shrugged. "I'll figure something out. I always have." The sadness in his voice broke Emma's heart. This kind, decent man had sacrificed so much for her over the years, had loved her as completely as any biological father could. And now she was contemplating leaving him behind for a world of luxury and opportunity. Before she could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was William himself, now dressed for dinner in a formal black suit that emphasized his resemblance to the portraits she'd seen hanging in the hallways. "I wanted to check on you before dinner," he said, his eyes searching her face for signs of how she was processing everything. "I know this is overwhelming. Your aunt doesn't want me here," Emma said directly. "Neither does your cousin." William sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that made him look younger and more vulnerable. "Margaret has been the lady of this house since my mother died. She's grown comfortable with that role, and she sees you as a threat to her position. As for Charles—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Charles stands to inherit a significant portion of my estate if I die without direct heirs. Your presence here changes that calculation, so I am a threat to them. You're not a threat, Emma. You're my daughter, and you have every right to be here. But yes, your existence complicates things for people who've grown comfortable with the way things were." Emma stood and walked to the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured gardens below. "My mother," she said quietly. "Tell me about her. Tell me about why she left you." William joined her at the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. "Catherine was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, but it wasn't just her looks that captivated me. She was intelligent, funny, kind to everyone regardless of their station in life. She worked as a seamstress in my mother's favorite dress shop, and I used to find excuses to accompany Mother there just to see Catherine." He smiled at the memory, his expression softening. "I was 23, fresh out of university, convinced I could conquer the world through sheer force of will. When I finally worked up the courage to speak to Catherine properly, I was amazed to discover she was just as interested in me as I was in her. But your family didn't approve." "My family was horrified," William said bluntly. "A Montgomery son, Pursuing a working-class woman was scandal enough, but when Catherine became pregnant, he shook his head. My father threatened to disown me. My mother took to her bed with what she claimed were heart palpitations. Margaret and Charles made it clear that marrying Catherine would mean social exile for the entire family. But you wanted to marry her anyway. I begged her to marry me. I promised we'd go away, start fresh somewhere new, where our backgrounds wouldn't matter. But Catherine was wiser than I was. She knew that asking me to give up my family, my inheritance, my entire way of life for her would eventually breed resentment. Between us, she loved me too much to let that happen. Emma turned to face him fully. So she disappeared. One night, she simply vanished, left a note saying she was releasing me from any obligation to her or the child, that it was better for everyone if we never saw each other again. By the time I found the note, she had a full day's head start, and she'd been very careful not to leave any clues about where she was going. But you looked for her. I looked for her for years, William said intensely. Hired investigators, placed advertisements in newspapers across 3 states, followed every lead, no matter how slim. But Catherine was resourceful, and she'd grown up moving from place to place with her own family. She knew how to disappear and stay disappeared. Emma absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the mother she'd known with this woman who'd led such a complicated double life. She never told me any of this. She said my father was dead, that he died in an accident before I was born. She was protecting you from a truth she thought would only bring you pain, and perhaps she was protecting herself from questions she didn't want to answer. A dinner bell chimed somewhere in the depths of the house, its sound echoing through. In corridors, Emma was only beginning to explore. We should go down, William said. Margaret prides herself on punctuality, and it's better not to give her additional reasons for displeasure. As they descended the grand staircase, Emma caught sight of herself in a hall mirror and was startled by what she saw. Her simple blue dress, which had seemed appropriate for dinner at Samuel's farm, looked distinctly out of place in these elegant surroundings. Her hair, braided simply down her back, seemed provincial compared to the elaborate styles she'd seen in the portraits lining the walls. The dining room was intimidating in its formal grandeur. A table that could have seated 20 was set for 5, with more silverware at each place than Emma typically used in a week. Crystal glasses caught the light from an enormous chandelier, and servants stood at attention along the walls, ready to anticipate every need. Margaret had changed into an evening gown of deep purple silk that must have cost more than Samuel made in a year. Charles wore a dinner jacket that fit him like it had been made specifically for his frame, which it probably had. Even Samuel had made an effort, wearing his best shirt and the coat he reserved for church services. Emma felt profoundly underdressed and out of place. "Emma," William said gently, "please sit here beside me." The placement was clearly significant. By seating Emma at his right hand, William was making a statement about her importance in his life that wouldn't be lost on anyone at the table. Margaret's lips tightened almost imperceptibly, but she said nothing as they all took their seats. The first course was served by silent, efficient servants, and for several minutes the only sounds were the gentle clink of silverware against china. Emma tried to follow the others' lead about which utensils to use, acutely aware that she was being watched and judged with every bite. "So, Emma," Charles said finally, his tone conversational but with an undertone she didn't like, "tell us about your education. I assume you've had some schooling." Emma looked up from her soup, sensing a trap but not sure how to avoid it. "I can read and write," she said carefully. "Samuel made sure I learned arithmetic and basic mathematics. I've read most of the books in our town's library." "How thorough," Charles said with a slight smile. "And what sort of books would those be?" Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks. She knew he was trying to embarrass her, to highlight the differences between her rural education and what someone of his class would consider proper learning. "The Bible, of course," she said evenly. "Some Shakespeare, though the language is difficult. A few novels by Mr. Dickens and Mr. Twain, books on history and geography when I could find them." William looked pleased by her answer, but Margaret seemed unimpressed. "Can you speak French?" she asked. "Play piano? Paint or draw?" "No, ma'am, I never had the opportunity to learn those things. I see." Margaret's tone suggested that Emma's lack of what she considered essential feminine accomplishments was a serious deficit. "And what skills do you possess?" Emma straightened her shoulders, refusing to be ashamed of her practical abilities. "I can cook and bake, tend a garden, preserve food for winter, care for livestock, mend clothes, and manage a household budget. I can nurse the sick and help with birthing, both for animals and people. I know which plants can heal and which can harm." The silence that followed her recitation was telling. These were all valuable skills, essential for survival in the world Emma came from, but they clearly held little value in Margaret's estimation. "How rustic," Margaret said finally, making the word sound like an insult. "How practical," William corrected firmly. "Those are skills that built this country, that created the wealth that allows us to sit in this dining room tonight." Charles leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "But surely, cousin, you don't intend for Emma to remain rustic. If she's to take her place in our family, she'll need proper education, proper training in the social graces." "Emma will receive whatever education she desires," William said, "but I hope she won't lose the valuable knowledge she's already gained. Too many people in our social circle have no idea how the basic necessities of life are actually produced." Emma listened to them discuss her future as if she weren't sitting right there, and felt a familiar flash of the independence that had carried her through the auction 3 days earlier. "If I might interrupt," she said politely but firmly, "I believe I should have some say in my own education and future." All eyes turned to her, and she realized she'd committed some sort of social error by speaking when the adults were talking. But she pressed on anyway. "I appreciate the opportunities you're offering, Mr. Montgomery, but I need to understand what accepting them would cost me and what would be expected of me in return." Margaret looked scandalized by Emma's directness, but William nodded approvingly. "What would you like to know? If I stay here, if I accept your name and your support, what happens to Samuel? He raised me, sacrificed for me, loved me as his own daughter. I won't abandon him for the sake of social advancement." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Emma watched William's face carefully, knowing that his answer would determine everything that came next. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the estate's library as Emma traced her finger along the spines of leather-bound books that represented more knowledge than she'd ever imagined existing in one place. She'd risen before dawn, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar luxury of her guest room, and had found her way here by following the scent of old paper and polished wood. It had been a week since the dinner that had ended so tensely, a week of careful conversations and watchful eyes as the Montgomery family adjusted to her presence. William had been nothing but kind, patient in answering her questions about his world, while never pressuring her to commit to staying. But Emma could feel the undercurrents of resentment and calculation flowing around her like invisible rivers. "You're an early riser." Emma turned to find Lucy entering with a tea service, her movements quiet and practiced. Over the past week, the young maid had become Emma's closest companion in this strange new world, the only person who seemed genuinely glad for her presence. "I couldn't sleep," Emma admitted, accepting the cup of steaming tea gratefully. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and find this has all been a dream." Lucy smiled as she arranged fresh flowers in a vase on the reading table. "Mr. William's been happier this week than I've seen him in years. Whatever else happens, you've given him something he'd lost hope of ever having. But I've also created problems for him. Emma said, settling into one of the leather chairs with her tea. "His aunt makes that clear every time she looks at me." "Miss Margaret's always been protective of the family reputation," Lucy said diplomatically, "and she's gotten used to running this house her way. Change is hard for some people." Emma was about to respond when the library doors opened to admit Charles Montgomery, impeccably dressed despite the early hour. He moved with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted his welcome anywhere. "Good morning, ladies," he said with a charming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Emma, I was hoping to find you here." Lucy immediately busied herself with unnecessary adjustments to the flower arrangement, but Emma could sense her tension. The maid had never said anything directly, but Emma had noticed how the servants seemed to make themselves scarce whenever Charles was around. "Did you need something?" Emma asked politely, though something in his manner made her want to maintain distance. "Actually, I thought you might enjoy a tour of the estate grounds. You haven't seen much beyond the main house, and there are some fascinating family monuments on the property, historical significance and all that." Emma glanced at Lucy, who was now pointedly not meeting her eyes. "That's very kind, but I was planning to spend the morning reading. Mr. Williams said I was welcome to use any of these books." "Oh, those dusty old things will be here whenever you want them," Charles said with a dismissive wave. "But the morning light is perfect for seeing the gardens, and I have some interesting stories about our ancestors that I think you'd enjoy." There was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't really a request, and Emma found herself nodding despite her reservations. "All right, let me just let Mr. William know where I'll be." "No need to bother William with such a trivial matter," Charles said quickly. "He's locked away in his study with some business correspondence. We'll be back long before he emerges." Lucy finally looked up, her expression worried. "Miss Emma, perhaps you'd like me to come along, to help with anything you might need." "That won't be necessary," Charles said before Emma could answer. "I'm perfectly capable of showing my cousin around our family property." Emma felt caught between competing undercurrents she didn't fully understand, but she followed Charles from the library, Lucy's concerned gaze following them until they were out of sight. The estate grounds were indeed magnificent. Charles led her through formal gardens where sculptured hedges created intricate patterns, past fountains that sparkled in the morning sun, and along gravel paths that wound between ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss. It was beautiful, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that this tour had a purpose beyond simple sightseeing. "This is where my great-grandfather first cleared the land," Charles said, stopping beside a marble monument that commemorated the estate's founding. 1823. He came here with nothing but ambition and built all of this through sheer determination. Emma read the inscription on the monument, noting how it emphasized the Montgomery family's vision and industry while making no mention of the enslaved, labor that had actually done most of the building. "It must be gratifying to know your family history so clearly," she said carefully. Charles studied her expression with interest. "Do you feel any connection to it? After all, it's your family history too now." Emma looked around at the carefully maintained grounds, at the evidence of wealth and power that stretched back nearly a century. "I suppose it is, though it doesn't feel real yet. I'm still trying to understand how I fit into all of this." "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about," Charles said, his tone becoming more serious. "There are things you should know, Emma, things that will help you make informed decisions about your future." They'd reached a secluded gazebo, surrounded by climbing roses, and Charles gestured for her to sit on one of the ornate benches inside. Emma complied, though her instincts were telling her to be wary. "What kind of things?" she asked. Charles settled beside her, closer than was entirely proper, and pulled out a leather portfolio from his jacket. "Documents that might interest you, about your mother, about the circumstances of your birth, about the legal realities of your situation." Emma's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Well, for instance, Charles said, opening the portfolio and extracting a sheet of paper, this is a copy of your birth certificate. Notice anything interesting about it? Emma took the document with trembling hands. It was indeed her birth certificate, but seeing it written out in official language made something that had always seemed abstract suddenly very real. Emma Catherine Sullivan, born April 15, 1842, in Milledgeville, Georgia. Father listed as unknown. Unknown, Emma whispered, the word hitting her like a physical blow. Your mother never listed William as your father on any official document, Charles explained, his voice gentle but relentless. Legally speaking, you have no claim to the Montgomery name or inheritance. William can acknowledge you all he likes. But that doesn't change the legal reality. Emma stared at the certificate, her mind reeling. She'd assumed that William's acknowledgement of paternity would automatically establish her legal rights, but apparently the situation was far more complicated. Then she'd understood. There's more, Charles continued, producing another document. This is a record of your mother's marriage to Samuel Hartwell. Notice the date. Emma looked at the marriage certificate, doing quick arithmetic in her head. Catherine had married Samuel when Emma was just 2 years old, meaning she'd spent those first 2 years as a single mother with an infant daughter to support. She was alone, Emma said quietly. Completely alone, Charles confirmed. No family support, no income beyond. What she could earn with her needle, and a child to feed and shelter. It must have been desperately difficult. Emma felt tears threatening as she imagined her mother's struggle during those early years. The Catherine she remembered had always seemed strong and capable, but she'd never spoken of the hardships she'd endured. "Why are you showing me this?" Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew. Charles leaned closer, his expression earnest. "Because I want you to understand the full situation before you make any irrevocable decisions. William is a good man, but he's also an idealist. He sees what he wants to see, believes what he wants to believe. The practical realities of your situation are more complex than he's admitted." "What practical realities?" Charles produced a third document, this one bearing an official seal. This is William's current will, filed with his attorney last year. As you can see, the bulk of his estate is divided between various charities and family members, with the largest single bequest going to me as his closest male relative. Emma scanned the legal language, picking out the key information. Charles was right. He stood to inherit a substantial portion of William's wealth, along with controlling interest in the textile mills that generated the family fortune. Now, Charles continued, William could certainly change his will to include you, but doing so would create complications, legal challenges, questions about your legitimacy, potential lawsuits from other family members. It would be messy and expensive, and there's no guarantee it would hold up in court. Emma set the documents aside, feeling overwhelmed by the legal complexities she'd never considered. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that there might be a more elegant solution to everyone's problems," Charles said smoothly, "one that would secure your future without creating unnecessary conflicts or complications." Emma waited, though she was beginning to dread. Whatever proposal he was building toward, "Marry me." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Emma stared at Charles, certain she'd misheard him. "I beg your pardon?" "Think about it logically," Charles continued, his tone becoming more persuasive. "As my wife, you'd have everything you could want. Social position, financial security, a place in the family that no one could question. You'd be a Montgomery by marriage, which is actually more secure than being one by questionable birth." Emma stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the gazebo. "You're asking me to marry you? We barely know each other." "Marriages based on practical considerations often work out better than those based on romantic notions," Charles said, rising to follow her. "We're compatible, we're both intelligent, and we both understand what we'd be gaining from the arrangement." "And what exactly would you be gaining?" Emma asked, though she thought she could guess. Charles smiled, and for the first time she saw something calculating behind his charm. "I'd be gaining a beautiful wife and the satisfaction of solving a delicate family problem. Plus, of course, there would be no question about my inheritance if you were my wife rather than William's potential." There it was. The real reason behind his sudden interest in her welfare, the tour of the grounds, the careful presentation of legal documents. Charles saw her as a threat to his financial future and was trying to neutralize that threat by bringing her under his control. "You're afraid I'm going to take your inheritance," Emma said bluntly. "I'm being practical about protecting interests that have been in my family for decades," Charles corrected. "But I'm also offering you something valuable in return. Marriage to me would give you instant respectability, wealth, and position. The alternative is years of legal battles and social ostracism as you try to prove a legitimacy that may not even exist." Emma felt a familiar fire rising in her chest, the same stubborn independence that had carried her through the auction and the difficult week that followed. "And if I refuse your generous offer?" Charles's expression hardened slightly. "Then you'll discover just how difficult life can be for a young woman with questionable parentage and no legal protections. Society can be very cruel to those who don't fit into accepted categories." "Is that a threat?" "It's a reality. I'm simply trying to spare you from learning it the hard way." Emma looked at this man who was ostensibly her cousin, who shared her blood, but seemed to view her primarily as a problem to be managed. The contrast with William's genuine affection and Samuel's unconditional love was stark and unsettling. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "Of course, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't remain available indefinitely." They walked back to the house in silence, Emma's mind churning with the implications of everything Charles had revealed. The legal questions about her status were real and troubling, but his proposed solution felt like trading one form of captivity for another. As they reached the main entrance, they encountered William emerging from his study, his face lighting up when he saw Emma. "There you are," he said warmly. "I was hoping we could spend some time together this morning. There are things I want to show you, papers and photographs that belong to your mother." Emma glanced at Charles, who was watching their interaction, with unreadable eyes. "I'd like that very much," she said. "Excellent. Charles, thank you for entertaining Emma. I hope you found the tour educational." "Very educational," Charles replied smoothly. "Emma and I had quite an enlightening conversation about family history and future possibilities." Something in his tone made William look more closely at both of them, but before he could ask questions, Margaret Montgomery appeared in the doorway. "William, we need to talk," she said without preamble. "Privately." William sighed, recognizing the tone that meant his aunt had worked herself into a state about something. "Of course. Emma, could you wait for me in the library? I'll join you shortly." As Emma headed toward the library, she heard the beginning of what promised to be a heated conversation. "This situation is becoming untenable," Margaret was saying. As the study door closed behind them, Emma tried to focus on selecting a book, but the voices from the study carried through the heavy wooden door. She couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was unmistakably argumentative. Margaret's voice sharp with frustration, William's firm but weary, and occasionally Charles's smooth interjections. After 20 minutes, the study door opened and Margaret emerged, her face flushed with anger. She stalked past the library without acknowledging Emma's presence, her silk skirts rustling with indignation. Charles followed a moment later, pausing in the library doorway. "Think carefully about our conversation, Emma," he said quietly. "Some opportunities don't come twice." Finally, William appeared, looking older and more tired than Emma had seen him since their reunion. He closed the library door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, as if gathering his strength. "Is everything all right?" Emma asked, though clearly it wasn't. William straightened and attempted a smile. "Family disagreements. Nothing that concerns you directly." But Emma was beginning to understand that in a family like this, everything concerned everyone else, whether directly or indirectly. The web of relationships, expectations, and financial interests was too complex for any issue to remain truly isolated. "Charles showed me some documents today," she said carefully. "About my legal status, about inheritance laws." William's expression grew very still. "What kind of documents?" Emma described the morning's conversation, watching William's face grow progressively darker as she spoke. By the time she finished, his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "That presumptuous little—" William stopped himself, taking a deep breath. "Emma, I want you to understand something very clearly. Your legal status is not in question. I am your father. I acknowledge you as my daughter, and I will ensure that you receive everything that rightfully belongs to you. But the birth certificate lists my father as unknown. Birth certificates can be amended. Legal documents can be corrected. I have lawyers who specialize in exactly these kinds of situations." William's voice carried absolute conviction. "Charles is trying to frighten you into making decisions that would benefit him, not you." Emma felt relief wash over her, but questions remained. Why would he do that? William was quiet for a long moment, staring out the library windows at the grounds, where she'd walked with Charles just hours before. "Because he's been raised to believe that wealth and position are the most important things in life, and your presence here threatens both for him. He sees you as competition rather than family." "And your aunt? Does she feel the same way?" "Margaret is concerned about social propriety and family reputation. She believes that acknowledging you publicly will create scandals that will reflect poorly on all of us." William turned back to face her. "She's wrong, but her fears aren't entirely unreasonable. Given the society we live in," Emma absorbed this information, beginning to understand the complex dynamics she'd stumbled into. "What did they want you to do in the meeting just now?" William's jaw tightened. "They wanted me to provide you with a generous settlement and arrange for you to live quietly somewhere far from here. Essentially, to pay you to disappear and never claim the Montgomery name publicly." The words hit Emma like a physical blow. "And what did you tell them?" William stepped closer, his eyes intense with emotion. "I told them that you are my daughter, that you belong here as much as anyone, and that I will not hide you away like some shameful secret. You have every right to the Montgomery name, to a place in this family, and to a share in everything you built." Emma felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than confusion. "Even if it costs you their approval, their support?" "Emma," William said gently, "I lost 17 years with you because I let other people's expectations and social pressures dictate my choices. I'm not going to make that mistake again." He moved to his desk and pulled out a key, using it to unlock a drawer that Emma hadn't noticed before. From it he extracted a wooden box, polished smooth with age and handling. "These belong to your mother," he said, setting the box on the reading table. "Letters she wrote to me, photographs we took together, things I've kept all these years, hoping that someday I'd be able to share them with you." Emma approached the box with trembling hands, lifting the lid to reveal treasures she'd never known existed. Photographs of a young Catherine, laughing and radiant in ways Emma had never seen her. Letters written in her mother's careful script, full of love and longing and hope. A pressed flower, a lock of red hair tied with blue ribbon, a small silver locket that had once belonged to Catherine's own mother. "She wrote to you," Emma whispered, holding one of the letters, "for the first year after she left. She told me about you, about your first steps and first words. She described how you looked, how you laughed, how you slept curled up like a kitten. William's voice grew thick with emotion. Then the letters stopped. I never knew if she'd decided it was too painful to continue, or if she'd moved somewhere my letters couldn't find her. Emma unfolded one of the letters, her mother's words reaching across 17 years of separation. "My dearest William, Emma said Papa today, though she has never seen your face. I told her about your eyes, about your laugh, about how much you would love her if you could hold her. She is so beautiful, William. She has your stubborn chin and my restless spirit. I pray that someday you will meet her and see what a miracle we created together." The words blurred as Emma's tears fell freely. This was the mother she'd never known, the woman who'd carried love and loss in equal measure, who'd sacrificed her own happiness to protect both Emma and William from the consequences of their choices. "She never stopped loving you," Emma said, looking up at William through her tears. "And I never stopped loving either of you," William replied. "Every decision I've made since she left has been with the hope that someday we'd be together again. The business I built, the wealth I accumulated, the position I earned in society, it was all meant to create a world where you and your mother could be safe and accepted." Emma wiped her eyes, feeling a new understanding of the man who was her father and the sacrifices he'd made in his own way. "What happens now?" William sat beside her, his expression resolute. "Now we move forward together. I'm going to change my will to reflect your rightful place as my heir. I'm going to publicly acknowledge you as my daughter at the Harvest Ball next month, where all of Georgia society will witness that you belong in this family. And I'm going to make sure you have every opportunity to become whatever you choose to be, even if Charles and Margaret oppose it." "Especially then," William said firmly. "They need to understand that the days of hiding family members out of social embarrassment are over. You are a Montgomery, Emma, and it's time the world knew it." Emma looked around the library at the thousands of books representing knowledge and opportunity she'd never dreamed of accessing. She thought about Samuel, alone on his struggling farm, about the simple life she'd known and the complex one being offered to her. She thought about Charles's veiled threats and Margaret's cold disapproval, about the challenges that lay ahead. But mostly, she thought about the man sitting beside her, who'd spent 17 years grieving for a daughter he'd never known, who was now willing to risk everything to give her the life she deserved. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's do it." William's face broke into the first genuinely joyful smile she'd seen from him since their reunion. "Are you sure?" Emma nodded, feeling a sense of rightness settle over her like a comfortable cloak. "I'm sure, but I have conditions." "Name them." "Samuel remains part of my life, always. Whatever happens, wherever I go, he's family too." "Agreed. And I don't want to become someone I'm not. I want to learn, to grow, to take advantage of the opportunities you're offering. But I don't want to lose the parts of myself that Samuel and my mother helped create." William reached over and took her hand, his eyes bright with pride and affection. "Emma, those parts of yourself are exactly what make you worth fighting for. I wouldn't change a thing about who you are." As they sat together in the library, surrounded by the tangible evidence of Catherine's love and William's devotion, Emma felt something shift inside her. For the first time since the auction, she wasn't thinking about what she was losing or what she was being forced to choose between. Instead, she was thinking about what she was gaining and what she was going to do with the extraordinary second chance she'd been given. The seamstress's shop on Bull Street in Savannah hummed with activity as 3 women worked feverishly on the most important dress of Emma's life. Madame Delacroix, a tiny French woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, circled around Emma like a hawk studying its prey, pins bristling from the cushion strapped to her wrist. "Turn slightly to the left, mademoiselle," she commanded in accented English. The bodice, it must fit like a second skin, no? Emma obediently shifted position, trying not to wince as another pin found its mark. The emerald silk gown taking shape around her was unlike anything she'd ever worn, or even imagined wearing. The rich fabric seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, and the cut was both elegant and daring by the standards she was accustomed to. "It's beautiful," she murmured, catching sight of herself in the full-length mirror. "It will be magnifique when we are finished," Madame Delacroix agreed. "But beauty, she's not the only purpose of this dress. This dress, she makes a statement, non." William, who'd been waiting patiently in the front of the shop, approached with a velvet box in his hands. "Speaking of statements," he said with a smile, "I believe this belonged to your great-grandmother Montgomery. It seems appropriate that you should wear it to your debut." Emma's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal an elaborate necklace of emeralds and pearls, the stones catching the afternoon light and throwing it back in brilliant flashes. It was the kind of jewelry she'd only seen in paintings, a testament to wealth and status that spoke louder than words. "I couldn't," she whispered. "What if something happened to it?" "Then we'd replace it," William said simply. "But nothing will happen to it, because it belongs to you now, just as everything else in our family belongs to you." As Madame Delacroix carefully fastened the necklace around Emma's throat, the weight of it seemed to settle not just on her neck, but on her entire being. In the mirror, she saw a young woman she barely recognized, someone who could belong in the grand ballrooms of Savannah society, someone who might hold her own among the wealthy and powerful. "The transformation, she is remarkable," Madame Delacroix observed with professional satisfaction. "But you, mademoiselle, you must remember, the dress and the jewels, they do not make the lady. The lady, she makes herself." Emma nodded, understanding the wisdom in those words even as she struggled to believe them. In 3 days, she would walk into the harvest ball at the Telfair mansion, where William would formally present her to society as his daughter and heir. It would be her first public appearance as Montgomery, and everyone in Savannah would be watching to see if she could live up to the name. The bell above the shop door chimed, and Charles Montgomery entered with an older man Emma didn't recognize. Both men removed their hats, but Emma noticed that Charles's eyes immediately sought her out, his gaze traveling over her appearance with an expression she couldn't quite read. "William," Charles said smoothly, "I didn't expect to find you here. And Emma, you look quite transformed." "Charles," William's voice carried a note of wariness. "What brings you to Madame Delacroix's establishment?" "I was showing Mr. Ashford around the city," Charles replied, gesturing to his companion. "This is Jonathan Ashford, one of the finest lawyers in Charleston. Mr. Ashford, my cousin William Montgomery, and his daughter, Emma." The slight pause before the word daughter was deliberate, Emma realized, as was the introduction of a lawyer at this particular moment. Mr. Ashford stepped forward with a polite bow, but his sharp eyes were already assessing her with professional interest. "Miss Montgomery," he said formally, "I've heard quite a lot about you recently." "Nothing too scandalous, I hope," Emma replied, surprised by her own composure. Ashford smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "On the contrary, your story is quite remarkable. A young woman discovering her true parentage, inheriting a fortune, rising from obscurity to prominence overnight. It's the kind of tale that captures the imagination." William stepped closer to Emma, his posture protective. "Mr. Ashford, while I'm sure your interest is purely academic, I should point out that my daughter's private affairs are not matters for public discussion." "Of course not," Ashford agreed quickly. "Though I confess, as a legal professional, I find myself curious about the documentation surrounding such a significant change in family circumstances." There it was. Emma felt her stomach tighten as she realized this entire encounter had been orchestrated. Charles had brought this lawyer here deliberately, to cast doubt on her legitimacy in front of witnesses, to plant seeds of uncertainty that would spread through Savannah society before the ball. "My daughter's legal status is perfectly clear," William said firmly. "Any questions about documentation have been thoroughly addressed by my own attorneys." "I'm sure they have," Ashford replied smoothly. "Though I must say, having reviewed similar cases, the legal complexities can be quite fascinating. Birth certificates with missing information, questions of legitimacy, the difference between social acknowledgement and legal recognition." "Mr. Ashford," Emma interrupted, her voice cutting through his veiled implications with surprising authority, "are you questioning my father's word or simply making conversation?" The directness of her question seemed to catch the lawyer off guard. He blinked, then recovered with a practiced smile. "Merely making conversation, Miss Montgomery. Legal matters have a way of intriguing those of us in the profession." "Then perhaps you should save your intrigue for clients who require your services," Emma replied coolly. "I believe my father's attorneys are quite capable of handling any legal matters that might arise." Madame Delacroix, who had been listening to this exchange with growing irritation, suddenly clapped her hands sharply. "Messieurs, please, this is a fitting room, not a courthouse. The young lady, she has important preparations to make, and your conversation, it disturbs the work." Charles's expression tightened at the dismissal, but he couldn't argue with the French seamstress without appearing ungentlemanly. "Of course, madame. We didn't mean to interrupt. Emma, we'll see you at the ball, I'm sure." As the two men left, Emma caught Charles looking back at her one final time, his gaze lingering on the emerald necklace at her throat. The look in his eyes made her skin crawl. It was the same calculating expression she'd seen in the gazebo, the look of a man who saw her as a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be respected. "That man," Madame Delacroix muttered as she resumed her work. "He brings trouble wherever he goes. I have dressed 3 of his former fiancés, and each one she ends up mysteriously calling off the engagement." Emma's blood ran cold. "Former fiancés? Oh yes, Charles Montgomery. He is quite the catch for ambitious mothers with daughters to marry. Rich, handsome, well-connected. But somehow the engagements, they never last. There are whispers, you understand, about his methods of persuasion." William's jaw had tightened during this revelation. "What kind of whispers?" The seamstress glanced around the shop, then leaned in conspiratorially. "They say he finds out secrets about the young ladies' families, financial troubles, social scandals, things that could ruin reputations if they became public. Then he uses what he knows to influence their decisions." Emma felt sick. The marriage proposal, the careful presentation of legal documents, the veiled threats about her social acceptance, it all made terrible sense now. Charles had been trying to blackmail her into marriage, just as he'd apparently done with other young women. "Why didn't any of them expose him?" she asked. Madame Delacroix shrugged expressively. "What would they expose? A man who knows their secrets? A cousin who was only trying to help them avoid embarrassment? He is very clever, très intelligent about how he operates." As they left the dress shop an hour later, Emma's mind was churning with implications. "He's been planning this from the moment he learned about me," she said to William, as their carriage wound through Savannah's historic district. "It appears so," William agreed grimly. "Which means we need to be prepared for whatever he might try at the ball." Emma stared out the carriage window at the elegant mansions lining the squares, each one representing a family with its own secrets and vulnerabilities. What if he really does have information that could hurt us? What if there's something about my birth or mother's past that could create a scandal? William was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. "There is something, Emma. Something I haven't told you about the circumstances of your birth." Emma turned to face him fully, her heart racing. "What do you mean? Your mother—" "Catherine wasn't just a seamstress when I met her. She was married." The words hit Emma like a physical blow. Married? To a man named Thomas Sullivan. He was much older than her, a mill foreman who drank too much and had a violent temper. Catherine married him when she was barely 16 because her family needed financial security. By the time I met her, she was desperately unhappy. But divorce was, well, it simply wasn't an option for a woman in her position. Emma stared at him, pieces of a puzzle she'd never known existed, suddenly clicking into place. So when she became pregnant with me, she was technically still married to Sullivan, yes, though she'd been living separately from him for months. By then, supporting herself with her sewing work. William's hands clenched in his lap. Sullivan had abandoned her, disappeared one night after a particularly violent episode. She thought he was gone for good. But he wasn't. He came back just before you were born, heard rumors about Catherine's pregnancy, probably smelled money in the situation. He threatened to claim you as his child, to demand financial support from my family in exchange for his silence. Emma felt the world tilting around her. What happened to him? William's expression grew dark. He had an accident, fell into the river one night after drinking heavily at a tavern. His body was found 3 days later. The implications hung in the air between them like a storm cloud. Emma understood now why her mother had fled, why she'd changed her name and moved constantly during Emma's early years. If there had been any suspicion that Thomas Sullivan's death wasn't accidental, if anyone had connected his threats about Catherine's pregnancy to his sudden demise. "You think Charles knows about this," Emma said quietly. "I think Charles has made it his business to know everything about our family that could potentially be used against us," William replied. "And if he does know, he'll wait until the most damaging moment to reveal it." Emma leaned back against the carriage seat, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of the web she'd stumbled into. Her mother's marriage to an abusive husband, her affair with William, the suspicious death of the man who'd threatened to expose their secret. It was the kind of scandal that could destroy reputations and ruin lives even 17 years after the fact. "Maybe I should reconsider," she said quietly. "Maybe it would be better if I quietly disappeared, lived under another name somewhere far from here. I don't want to be the cause of destroying everything you've built." William reached over and took her hand firmly. "Emma, listen to me. Your mother spent years running from her past, hiding from shadows, living in fear of what people might discover or say. I won't let you make the same choice. Whatever Charles thinks he knows, whatever weapons he believes he has, we'll face them together. But if the scandal breaks, if people start asking questions about Thomas Sullivan's death, then we'll deal with it. The truth is that your mother was trying to escape an abusive marriage, that she found love and happiness with me, and that you were created out of that love. Anyone who wants to twist that into something sordid says more about their own character than ours." Emma looked into her father's eyes and saw absolute determination there, the same stubborn strength that had driven him to search for her for 17 years. She realized that backing down now wouldn't protect either of them. It would only give Charles and his allies exactly what they wanted. "All right," she said, squaring her shoulders. "Then we go to the ball, and I claim my place as your daughter, regardless of what anyone might say or do to stop us." William smiled, and for the first time since learning about Thomas Sullivan, Emma felt a spark of hope. "That's my daughter," he said with pride. "Catherine would be so proud of the woman you've become." As the carriage rolled through the gates of Willowbrook Estate, Emma caught sight of Charles standing on the front veranda, watching their approach with that same calculating expression she was learning to dread. But this time, instead of feeling intimidated by his gaze, she met it directly, letting him see that she understood exactly what kind of game he was playing. The storm was gathering. She could feel it in the tension that seemed to crackle in the air around the estate. In 3 days, at the harvest ball, all the careful maneuvering and veiled threats would come to a head. Charles would make his move, Margaret would play her cards, and Emma would finally discover whether she had the strength to claim the life. That was rightfully hers, but as she climbed down from the carriage wearing her simple day dress, with the memory of emerald silk and ancestral jewels still fresh in her mind, Emma Montgomery felt ready for whatever storm might come. She had found her family, discovered her heritage, and learned the truth about her past. Now it was time to fight for her future. The crystal chandeliers of the Telfair mansion cast rainbow prisms across hundreds of guests as Emma descended the grand staircase on William's arm. Her emerald silk gown rustled with each step, and the weight of her great-grandmother's necklace served as a constant reminder of the heritage she was claiming tonight. Every conversation in the ballroom seemed to pause as heads turned to watch. "Her entrance, breathe," William murmured under his breath, his own tension barely concealed beneath his formal evening wear. "You belong here as much as anyone in this room." Emma lifted her chin slightly, drawing on reserves of courage she'd discovered over the past weeks. The faces looking up at her were a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and in some cases, barely concealed hostility. She recognized several prominent Savannah families from William's descriptions, their expressions ranging from welcoming to calculating. At the bottom of the staircase, their hosts awaited them. Colonel Marcus Telfair, one of Savannah's most influential citizens, stepped forward with his wife Eleanor, both dressed in the height of fashion and wearing practiced social smiles. "William," Colonel Telfair said warmly, extending his hand, "we're honored to host such a momentous occasion." "Marcus, Eleanor, thank you for opening your home to us tonight," William replied, then turned toward Emma with unmistakable pride. "I'd like you to meet my daughter, Emma Catherine Montgomery." Eleanor Telfair's smile didn't waver, but Emma caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "Miss Montgomery, welcome to Savannah society. We've heard so much about you." "All good. Things, I hope," Emma replied with a grace that surprised even herself. "Naturally," Colonel Telfair interjected smoothly, though his gaze lingered on her necklace with recognition. "That's quite a remarkable piece of jewelry you're wearing. Montgomery family heirloom?" "It belonged to my great-grandmother, Emma," confirmed, noting how the admission sent ripples of whispered conversation through the nearby guests. By claiming the necklace, she was making a public statement about her legitimacy that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. As they moved into the main ballroom, Emma felt the weight of dozens of eyes following their progress. The orchestra played a gentle waltz, and couples glided across the polished floor beneath murals depicting scenes from Georgia's colonial history. It was a world of refinement and tradition that seemed both magnificent and fragile. Emma, darling, she turned to see a young woman approaching with genuine enthusiasm, her blonde curls bouncing with each step. Behind her followed a distinguished older gentleman with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Allow me to introduce my daughter Caroline," the man said with a slight bow. "I'm Judge Harrison, and Caroline has been absolutely insistent on meeting you ever since the invitations went out." Caroline Harrison linked arms with Emma as if they'd been friends for years. "You must tell me everything," she whispered conspiratorially. "The most romantic story I've ever heard, discovering your true father, inheriting a fortune, rising from humble beginnings to claim your rightful place. It's like something from a novel." Emma found herself smiling genuinely for the first time. That evening, "It's been quite overwhelming, I must admit. I can imagine, but how thrilling. And that dress is absolutely divine. Is it from Madame Delacroix?" "I thought so. She has such an eye for what suits each figure." Judge Harrison chuckled at his daughter's enthusiasm. "Caroline has appointed herself your unofficial guide to Savannah society, Miss Montgomery. I hope you don't mind her directness. On the contrary, I find it refreshing, Emma replied, meaning it. After weeks of navigating veiled comments and hidden agendas, Caroline's open friendliness was like a breath of fresh air. As they chatted, Emma became aware of a commotion near the ballroom's entrance. Charles had arrived impeccably dressed and accompanied by Margaret, who wore black silk that made her look like an elegant raven. Behind them walked Jonathan Ashford, the Charleston lawyer, his presence an ominous reminder of the threats that had been building toward this moment. "Oh dear," Caroline murmured, following Emma's gaze. "Charles Montgomery looks like he's plotting something, and who's that severe-looking gentleman with him?" Before Emma could answer, the orchestra concluded their piece with a flourish, and Colonel Telfair moved to the center of the ballroom. The conversations gradually died away as guests turned their attention to their host. "Ladies and gentlemen," Telfair announced, his voice carrying easily across the vast room, "we gather tonight to celebrate not only our annual harvest season, but also a very special occasion. My dear friend William Montgomery has asked to make an announcement that I'm sure will interest you all." Emma felt her heart begin to race. This was the moment they'd been building toward, the public acknowledgement that would either secure her place in society or expose her to scandal and ridicule. William stepped forward, his posture confident despite the tension Emma could read in the set of his shoulders. "My friends, for 17 years I have carried a secret that has weighed heavily on my heart. Tonight I wish to share with you the greatest joy of my life." He gestured for Emma to join him in the center of the room. As she walked toward him, her silk gown catching the light with each step, she could hear the rustle of fans and the whisper of speculative conversation. "I present to you my daughter, Emma Catherine Montgomery," William said, his voice ringing with pride and determination. "For too many years, circumstances kept us apart, but Providence has finally reunited us. I ask you to welcome her not as a stranger, but as a beloved member of one of Georgia's oldest families." The applause that followed was polite but measured, the kind of response that suggested the audience was still reserving judgment. Emma curtsied gracefully, aware that every gesture was being scrutinized and evaluated. "Miss Montgomery," called out a voice from the crowd. Emma turned to see Jonathan Ashford stepping forward, his expression grave. "If I may, there are some questions about the documentation surrounding this remarkable reunion that might interest our assembled friends." A hush fell over the ballroom. Emma felt William stiffen beside her, and she could sense the anticipation rippling through the crowd like electricity before a storm. "Mr. Ashford," William said coldly, "this is neither the time nor the place for legal discussions." "On the contrary," Ashford replied smoothly, "when someone claims inheritance rights and family status, it becomes a matter of public interest, particularly when that person's birth certificate lists her father as unknown." Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to remain composed. This was exactly what they'd expected, what they'd prepared for. "Furthermore," Ashford continued, clearly enjoying the drama he was creating, "there are questions about the young lady's mother, Catherine Sullivan, and the mysterious circumstances surrounding her first husband's death." The word, death, sent a shockwave through the assembled guests. Emma could see faces turning toward her with new speculation, whispered questions beginning to buzz through the crowd like angry bees. Charles stepped forward then, his expression a masterpiece of feigned concern. "I'm afraid there are serious doubts about Emma's legitimacy, both legal and moral. While we all sympathize with William's desire to acknowledge his connection to this young woman, we cannot ignore the facts." "And what facts are those?" Emma asked, her voice cutting through the murmurs with surprising strength. Charles smiled, but it was cold and calculating. That your mother was married to another man when you were conceived, that Thomas Sullivan died under suspicious circumstances shortly before your birth, that your mother fled Georgia immediately afterward, living under assumed names for years. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma could feel the weight of hundreds of stares, the judgment and speculation that threatened to crush her where she stood. This was the moment she dreaded, when all her mother's secrets and her own uncertain origins would be exposed to public scrutiny. But as she looked around the ballroom at the shocked faces, the whispered conversations, the mixture of fascination and disapproval, something unexpected happened. Instead of shame or fear, Emma felt a fierce surge of protective anger, not for herself, but for her mother's memory. "You're right," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. "My mother was married to Thomas Sullivan, a violent drunk who abandoned her and then returned to threaten her when he learned she was carrying another man's child." The crowd stirred uneasily at her directness, but Emma pressed on, her voice growing stronger with each word. She was 16 when she married him, forced into it by poverty and circumstance. She endured his abuse for 2 years before she found the courage to leave. And yes, she found love with my father while she was still technically married to a man who had already abandoned her. She turned to face Charles directly, her eyes blazing with inherited fire. As for Thomas Sullivan's death, he drowned while drunk, which was hardly surprising given his habits. My mother had nothing to do with it, and the suggestion that she did is not only false, but despicable. The ballroom had gone completely silent. Emma could hear her own heartbeat, could sense the collective held breath of the assembled crowd. My mother was guilty of nothing more than trying to escape an impossible situation and find happiness with a man who truly loved her, Emma continued. She was brave and strong, and she made sacrifices to protect both me and my father from exactly this kind of public judgment. She lifted her chin, meeting the stares around her with defiant pride. "I am not ashamed of my origins. I'm not ashamed of my mother's choices, and I'm certainly not ashamed to be William Montgomery's daughter." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the ballroom remained frozen in shocked silence. Then from somewhere in the crowd came the sound of slow, deliberate clapping. Emma turned to see Judge Harrison stepping forward, his applause echoing through the vast room. "Beautifully said, Miss Montgomery. It takes considerable courage to speak the truth so openly." Carolyn joined her father's applause, her young face bright with admiration. "Hear, hear. I think Emma has shown more grace under pressure than any of us have a right to expect." One by one, other guests began to clap, the sound building gradually, until it filled the ballroom. Not everyone joined in. Emma could see pockets of disapproval and whispered dissent, but enough people showed their support to make it clear that public opinion was not uniformly against her. Colonel Telfair stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Ashford, while I appreciate your legal perspective, I believe this evening is intended for celebration, not character assassination. Miss Montgomery has answered your accusations with admirable honesty and dignity." Ashford's face flushed with embarrassment and anger, but he couldn't argue with their host without appearing ungracious. Charles, too, looked stunned by the turn events had taken. His carefully orchestrated ambush had not only failed to destroy Emma's reputation, but had somehow backfired, making her appear sympathetic and courageous. William stepped closer to Emma, his arm encircling her shoulders protectively. "My daughter has shown tonight why I am so proud to claim her as my own. She faces adversity with courage, speaks truth with conviction, and honors her mother's memory with dignity." He turned to address the crowd directly. "I will be changing. My will to reflect Emma's rightful place as my heir. The Montgomery name, fortune, and legacy will pass to her, as they should have from the moment of her birth." This announcement sent another ripple of conversation through the ballroom, but the tone was different now. more speculative than scandalized, more accepting than hostile. As the orchestra resumed playing and conversations gradually returned to normal topics, Emma found herself surrounded by well-wishers and curious society matrons. Not everyone was friendly. She could still feel cold stares from certain quarters, but the immediate crisis had passed. Charles retreated to a corner, with Margaret and Ashford, their faces dark with frustrated anger. Their gambit had failed, and Emma could see them already calculating their next move. "You were magnificent," Caroline Harrison whispered, squeezing Emma's arm. "I've never seen anyone handle Charles Montgomery so effectively." He looked positively green when you turned his accusations back on him. Emma smiled, but she knew the victory was only temporary. Charles wouldn't give up so easily, and there would be other challenges ahead. But for tonight, she had claimed her place in Savannah society and honored her mother's memory in the process. As William led her onto the dance floor for the evening's first formal waltz, Emma felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a comfortable cloak. She was Emma Montgomery now, officially and publicly. Whatever came next, she would face it as herself, with all the strength her parents had given her and all the courage she'd discovered within herself. The emerald necklace caught the chandelier light as they danced, sending sparkles across the ballroom like stars, and Emma allowed herself to feel, for the first time since the auction, that she was exactly where she belonged. 6 months after the harvest ball, Emma stood in the doorway of the newly completed schoolhouse, watching as 24 children from the surrounding farms and mill villages took their seats at polished wooden desks. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating faces that ranged from eager to skeptical, but all curious about their unconventional new teacher. "Good morning, everyone," Emma said, her voice carrying the confidence she'd developed through months of preparation. "My name is Miss Montgomery, and I'm here because I believe every child deserves the chance to learn, regardless of where they come from or what their parents do for work." She moved to the blackboard, where she'd written out the day's lessons. In her careful script, behind her, she could hear the rustle of clothing and whispered conversations as the children adjusted to their new environment. This school, built with Montgomery money but designed according to Emma's vision, represented something revolutionary in rural Georgia. Education that bridged the gap between social classes. Now, I know some of you are wondering why a lady from the big house would want to teach children from the mills and farms, Emma continued, turning back to face her students. The answer is simple: because I was once exactly like you. A hand shot up from the back row. A girl, about 12 years, old with work-roughened hands and patches on her dress, looked both brave and nervous. "Miss Montgomery, is it true you was sold at auction like a horse?" Emma smiled, unfazed by the directness of the question. She'd learned to appreciate honesty above polite evasion. "Yes, Mary Beth, it's true. My stepfather was desperate to pay his debts, and he put me up for sale in the courthouse square." Gasps echoed through the small classroom, but Emma continued calmly. "I know what it feels like to be powerless, to have other people make decisions about your life without asking what you want. That's why education is so important. It gives you choices and the knowledge to make good ones." She picked up a piece of chalk and began writing on the board. "Today, we're going to start with reading, then move on to arithmetic, and after lunch we'll have a science lesson about how plants grow. But first, I want each of you to tell me your name and one thing you dream of doing when you're grown." The children introduced themselves: the miller's son who wanted to build bridges, the seamstress's daughter who hoped to become a doctor, the farm boy who dreamed of writing books. Emma felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with social position or inherited wealth. This was what she'd been meant to do with the opportunities William had given her. The morning passed quickly, and as the children settled into their midday meal, Emma stepped outside to find Samuel approaching the schoolhouse with a covered basket. He walked with less of a limp now, the result of better nutrition and medical care that William had quietly arranged. "Thought you might be hungry," Samuel said, setting the basket on the school's front steps. "Lucy sent along some of her famous cornbread and honey." Emma hugged him warmly, still marveling at how their relationship had evolved. No longer her guardian, but not quite her equal, Samuel had found a new role as her trusted advisor and the school's unofficial caretaker. William had offered him a cottage on the estate grounds and work managing the agricultural experiments they were conducting with new farming techniques. "How are they taking to you?" Samuel asked, nodding toward the sounds of children's voices drifting from inside the schoolhouse. "Better than I expected," Emma admitted. "A few are still suspicious. Their parents have told them stories about fancy ladies who think they know what's best for everyone. But most are just hungry to learn." They sat together on the steps, sharing Lucy's cornbread, while watching clouds drift across the Georgia sky. It was a peaceful moment, but Emma could see something troubling in Samuel's expression. "What's wrong?" she asked. Samuel was quiet for a moment, then pulled a folded letter from his pocket. "Got this yesterday, from a lawyer in Atlanta." Emma's stomach tightened as she took the letter and read the official language that essentially boiled down to a legal challenge to her inheritance. The document cited questions about her legitimacy and demanded a formal court hearing to determine her rightful status. "Charles," she said simply. "Most likely, though he's been clever about it. The challenge comes from some distant Montgomery relatives I've never heard of. Cousins from the Virginia branch of the family, apparently." Emma folded the letter carefully, her mind already working through the implications. "He's not giving up." "Doesn't seem to be. William know about this yet? I'll tell him tonight. Though I suspect he's been expecting something like this." Emma stood, brushing crumbs from her skirt. "Charles lost face at the ball, and his type doesn't forgive public humiliation easily." The afternoon lessons went smoothly, but Emma found her thoughts occasionally drifting to the legal challenge. She'd known this period of relative peace couldn't last forever. Charles had been notably absent from Savannah social events since the ball, but she'd heard rumors that he'd been traveling, meeting with family members and legal advisors. As the last student departed with promises to practice their letters, Emma gathered her teaching materials and prepared for the carriage ride back to Willowbrook Estate. The routine had become comfortable over these months. Mornings at the school, afternoons helping William with estate business, or meeting with the various charitable organizations she'd become involved with. The transformation of her life sometimes still amazed her. She, who had once faced auctioneer's chattel, now controlled a trust fund worth more than most people would see in several lifetimes. She, who had been denied education beyond basic literacy, now corresponded with women's colleges in the North about advanced study opportunities. But perhaps the most significant change was in her relationship with William. They'd moved beyond the tentative politeness of their early weeks together into something that felt genuinely familial. He sought her opinions on business matters, trusted her judgment about social situations, and increasingly relied on her insight into the lives of people outside their privileged circle. When Emma arrived at the estate that evening, she found William in his study with an unexpected visitor. Through the open door, she could see him deep in conversation with a woman she didn't recognize, elderly, well-dressed, with silver hair and intelligent eyes. "Emma?" William called when he noticed her in the doorway. "Perfect timing. I'd like you to meet someone very special." The woman turned with a smile that seemed to light up her entire face. "So this is the famous Emma Montgomery I've been hearing so much about. My dear, you're even more lovely than William described." "Emma, this is Mrs. Victoria Ashworth," William said, his voice carrying an odd mix of pride and nervousness. "She's an old friend of your mother's." Emma felt her heart skip. "You knew my mother?" "Knew her? Child, I love Catherine like a sister." We worked together at Madame Rousseau's dress shop before. Mrs. Ashworth's expression grew sad. Before life took us down different paths. She studied Emma's face intently. You have her eyes, you know. That same spark of determination that made Catherine special. And your father's stubborn chin, though I suspect you've already discovered that about yourself. Emma found herself drawn to this woman who represented a connection to her mother's past she'd never expected to find. Please, tell me about her, about who she was before. Before everything became complicated, Mrs. Ashworth settled into one of the leather chairs, her expression growing warm with memory. Catherine was the most spirited girl you ever saw. Quick with a needle, quicker with her wit, and absolutely fearless when it came to standing up for what she believed was right. She once talked back to Colonel Henderson's wife when the woman was berating a young shop girl, despite knowing it could cost her job. That sounds like her, Emma said softly, remembering her mother's quiet but firm moral compass. When she fell in love with your father, it was like watching a flower bloom. She positively glowed with happiness, despite all the obstacles they effaced. Mrs. Ashworth's gaze shifted between Emma and William. She used to say that someday she'd find a way for the three of you to be together, that love would find a way. Why didn't you stay in touch? Emma asked. After she left Georgia? Mrs. Ashworth's expression grew troubled. Catherine asked me not to. She said it was safer for everyone if she disappeared completely, started fresh with no connections to her old life. I respected her wishes, but I never stopped wondering what became of her. She reached into her reticule and pulled out a small wrapped package. I brought something I thought you should have. Catherine gave this to me just before she left, said if anything ever happened to her I should find her daughter and make sure she got it. Emma unwrapped the package with trembling fingers to reveal a small leather journal, its pages filled with her mother's handwriting. As she opened it, she realized it was a record of her early childhood. First words, first steps, favorite songs, funny things she'd said. A treasure trove of memories Catherine had preserved but never been able to share. She wrote in it every day for the first 5 years of your life, Mrs. Ashworth explained. Then she gave it to me, saying she was afraid that having it with her made her too tempted to dwell in the past instead of building a future. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she read an entry from her 4th birthday. Emma insisted on making me a cake today, though she used mostly flour and love. She told me it was the most beautiful cake in the world, and when I tasted it, somehow it was. There's something else, Mrs. Ashworth said gently. Catherine wrote you a letter to be delivered when you came of age. She gave it to me the same day as the journal. With shaking hands, Emma accepted the sealed envelope marked with her name in her mother's careful script. The weight of it seemed enormous, containing as it did a final message from the woman who'd shaped her early years and then sacrificed everything to protect her. I'll read it later, Emma said quietly, not trusting herself to open it in front of others. Mrs. Ashworth nodded understandingly. Of course, dear, it's meant for you alone. As they talked through the evening, sharing stories and memories that brought Catherine back to vivid life, Emma felt pieces of herself she'd never understood finally clicking into place. Her mother's courage, her sacrifices, her unwavering love. All of it became real in ways it had never been before. When Mrs. Ashworth finally departed with promises to visit again soon, Emma found herself alone with William in his study. The legal challenge letter seemed far less threatening now, overshadowed by the gift of understanding she'd received. "Are you all right?" William asked, noting her emotional state. "Better than all right," Emma replied. "For the first time I feel like I truly understand who my mother was and why she made the choices she did." She pulled the legal document from her bag and handed it to William. "Charles is making his move, but I'm not afraid anymore." William read the challenge with a grim expression, but when he looked up at Emma, his eyes held admiration rather than Concern. You've changed, Emma. 6 months ago, something like this would have terrified you. 6 months ago, I was still running from my past instead of embracing it, Emma replied. I know who I am now, Catherine Sullivan's daughter and William Montgomery's heir. I'm not ashamed of either part of that identity. She stood, her mother's letter still clutched in her hand. Whatever Charles wants to throw at us in court, we'll face it together. I have nothing to hide anymore. As Emma climbed the stairs to her room, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the auction block to the schoolhouse, from shame about her origins to pride in her heritage, she'd discovered strength she'd never known she possessed. That night, by candlelight, she finally opened her mother's letter. The words blurred through her tears, but the message was clear. Live boldly, love completely, and never let anyone make you feel less than worthy of every good thing this world has to offer. Outside her window, Willowbrook Estate slept peacefully under a blanket of stars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Emma Montgomery faced the future with confidence, surrounded by love and secure in the knowledge of exactly who she was meant to be. The auction that had nearly destroyed her had instead become the beginning of her true life, and that, she thought, as she drifted off to sleep, was the most remarkable transformation of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.